than any of the fires in the World Trade Center. The second reason is the specific nature of the collapses, each feature of which points to explosives. For example, the buildings collapsed straight down and at virtually free fall speed, as in controlled demolitions. And then the rubble smoldered for months afterwards. With regard to the Twin Towers in particular, many people in the building said that they felt or heard explosions. Virtually all the concrete of these enormous structures was pulverized into very fine dust.
This was the South Tower. This was 104, 106 stories tall. This is what is left. Up there was the North Tower. And you look, and you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel.
What happened to the concrete?
The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of Lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
Try this. Get a piece of concrete and drop it a little over 1,000 feet and see if it pulverizes into very fine dust. It won't happen. Much of this dust, along with steel and aluminum, was blown out horizontally from the buildings several hundred feet. Most of the steel beams and columns came down in sections about 30 feet long, conveniently ready to be loaded onto trucks. And pools of molten steel were found beneath the rubble.
This is how it's been since day one. Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. And it was just a bright reddish orange color. See that stuff he's pulling out? What was that, Chief? We're gonna hold off on the water. See the stuff he's pulling out? Yeah. It's red hot. If we hit it too much steam, you won't be able to see what he's doing.
Great.
These and even more effects point to the existence of very powerful, precisely placed explosives. A third thing supporting the theory of controlled demolitions is evidence of a deliberate cover-up. If the building's steel columns and beams had indeed been broken by explosives, an examination of the steel would have revealed this fact. However, although it is normally a federal offense to remove anything from a crime scene, the steel was quickly loaded onto trucks and put on ships headed for Asia to be melted down. I will mention one more example of the cover-up. Insofar as there is an official story as to why the towers collapsed, it is the pancake theory, according to which the floors above the destruction caused by the airplanes collapsed on the floor below, and then those floors collapsed on the floor below that, and then it pancaked all the way down. Now, even if this theory were remotely plausible, can you imagine it pancaking at free fall speed? The other problem is what happened to the 47 massive steel columns that constituted the core of each of these twin towers. They were the weight-bearing structures of each tower. Those 47, even if the pancake theory were true, those 47 steel beams should have been sticking up at least several hundred feet into the air, just like the old phonographs, where sometimes the 78 records would collapse, but the spindle's still sticking up in the air. You should have had 47 spindles still sticking up in the air. Well, what did the 9/11 Commission report do about that problem? It avoided the problem incredibly by simply denying the existence of these columns, even though those columns, I'm not making this up. These columns were the unique feature of these towers when they were first built. So, the Commission report, after saying falsely that most of the weight of each tower was borne by the steel columns in its exterior walls, this supposedly authoritative report said the interior core of the buildings was a hollow steel shaft in which elevators and stairwells were grouped. Such a desperate lie is a sure sign of a cover-up. In any case, when we look at all these features of the collapses, the idea that they could have been caused by the impact of the airplanes plus the resulting fires is ridiculous. This is even clearer with regard to building number 7, which wasn't hit by any airplane, and yet it came down about 5:30 that afternoon. Its collapse remains so impossible to explain, except as controlled demolition, that the 9/11 Commission report did not even mention it, as if the collapse of a 47-story building was not worthy of comment. And it only had fires on floors numbers 7 and 12 of 47 stories.
Big round of applause for Mr. Jeff King.
Can I still be wearing this? Okay. I studied physics at MIT. I did electrical engineering for about 8 years. I've had quite a bit of practical engineering experience. When I first saw the collapses, I was absolutely convinced that they were not spontaneous. One of the first things that I did was to speak with one of my patients, who is a retired Army Corps of Engineers fellow who's done a lot of demolition and construction. Showed him some of the public source videos that are available of it, and he immediately pointed out that there were squibs, which represent little puffs of smoke essentially coming out of the buildings initially, which were clearly a sign of controlled demolition. He had no opinions beyond that, but he said without doubt that it was a controlled demolition. That sort of set me on the path of continuing to examine it and trying to gather as much evidence as I could. And the question I pose, what don't we know and why don't we know it, is sort of addressing the fact that at this point we still do not really have a meaningful explanation for what happened to the buildings. We have had several studies at this point, which I will go into, as to trying to determine a plausible scenario for the collapse. As of this point, none of them have presented us with anything that I think could be reasonably called a convincing and detailed account of why the collapse has occurred. And the question that's been addressed previously, the enormous destruction of physical evidence, as Chris was saying, the site was scrubbed very thoroughly. Out of the entire mass of the buildings that were destroyed, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, who are now doing the ongoing investigation, managed to save about 240 pieces out of the entire building. All of the rest of it was basically recycled. You know, the obvious question is what does it mean that there was a controlled demolition? At the simplest level, it means that someone had a lot of access to the buildings over a long enough period of time to set this up. It implies, as many other things have tonight, that the people who had effective control of the site had an interest in having it scrubbed and making sure that no